Everybody remembers the woman. Almost nobody notices the king who had started believing he could take whatever he wanted. And this is where the simple version begins to crack. The story is usually reduced to a scandal. A king, a woman, a desire, a fall. Very neat, very dramatic, very easy to summarize in one sentence and move on. But that version is too clean, because the problem does not begin with Bathsheba. It begins with David. David was not just a man having an ordinary moment of weakness. He was the king. He had authority, he had servants, he had messengers, he had soldiers, he had an entire palace trained to respond when he spoke. That changes the story. When an ordinary person wants something wrong, there are still barriers. There are people who can refuse. There are rules that can stop the moment from becoming action. But when a king wants something wrong, the system itself may help him get it. And when someone with power begins confusing desire with entitlement, the damage rarely stays private for long. David had already won battles. He had survived enemies. He had built a reputation. He had become the man people admired, followed, and sang about. Which is wonderful. It is also exactly the kind of success that can make a person quietly believe the rules have become optional. Like a leader who has won so often that correction starts sounding like disrespect. David had not reached the terrace yet. Bathsheba had not entered the scene. No messenger had been sent. No order had been given. But the deeper problem was already there. Power had become normal. Obedience had become normal. Getting an answer whenever he asked had become normal. And once power becomes ordinary, limits can begin to feel strangely inconvenient. The issue was not one woman. The issue was a man with enough authority to turn a private want into a public command. That is the part many retellings soften. They focus on attraction because attraction is easy to understand, but attraction alone did not send anyone across the city. Power did. A thought could become a question. A question could become an investigation. An investigation could become an order. And in a palace built around obedience, almost nobody was positioned to ask whether the king should be doing any of it. That silence mattered. A room full of people can still become an echo chamber when every career depends on keeping one powerful man comfortable. Apparently, unlimited authority and zero honest feedback were not the ideal combination. Shocking. David still looked successful, still looked respected, still looked completely in control. But the danger had already started. Not in the courtyard, not in the messenger's hands, not in Bathsheba's presence. It had started inside a man who had slowly forgotten that being able to take something did not mean he had the right to take it. That distinction would change everything. And the terrace was not even the beginning. David's fall did not begin with desire. It began with the feeling that he could cross a line and somehow avoid the cost. Before the famous scene, there was already a crack. Too much comfort, too much distance from responsibility, too much authority without resistance, too much silence around a king almost nobody wanted to challenge. At the time when kings normally went out to war, David stayed in Jerusalem. That detail matters. Distance from duty does not automatically produce disaster, but it creates empty space. And empty space, combined with unchecked power, can turn a passing thought into a decision before anyone around the king realizes what is happening. The army was in the field, commanders were taking risks. Soldiers were sleeping on hard ground, following orders, and doing the work the king was expected to lead. David was in the palace, safe, comfortable, unoccupied enough to wander onto the roof, because apparently being surrounded by power, comfort, and absolutely no accountability always produces excellent decisions. Of course, this was not about David being unintelligent. He was not. It was not about him having no faith. He had a long history of faith. It was not about him lacking experience. He had faced danger, pressure, betrayal, and war. The problem was that success had changed the environment around him. People obeyed quickly, servants moved when he spoke, messengers carried his questions without demanding explanations. And the more a person gets used to immediate obedience, the easier it becomes to mistake access for permission. It is like a leader who stops listening to feedback because everyone around him depends on his approval. At first, nobody says anything because the decision seems small. Then nobody says anything because speaking feels risky. Eventually, silence starts looking like agreement. That is how power distorts a room. David had external authority, but he was losing internal restraint. And that is a dangerous trade. A person can control armies and still fail to control an impulse. A person can win public battles and still become careless in private. The palace did not create the weakness. It removed friction. There were fewer people able to say no, fewer consequences visible in the moment, fewer reminders that a king was still supposed to answer to something higher than his own appetite. So David walked onto the roof. From there, he saw a woman bathing. The text does not turn this into a romance. It does not describe a meaningful connection. There is no conversation, no relationship, no long emotional struggle. There is a look, then a question. He asked who she was. That question was not harmless, because a king's curiosity had resources behind it. Someone would investigate. Someone would return with a name. Someone would explain that she was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. In other words, the boundary was clearly identified. She was not available. The answer should have ended the moment. Instead, it gave David an address. And then a look became an order. And then a look became an order. David sent messengers to bring Bathsheba to the palace. That is the moment the story changes. It is no longer just attraction. It is no longer a private impulse. It is no longer a complicated situation. It is a king using his position to take what was not his. That part often gets softened because the story is easier to tell when it sounds like two people simply made the same bad decision. But David was not simply another man in the city. He was the man in charge. He had access. He had authority. He had people trained to carry out his instructions. When an ordinary person wants something wrong, there are still external limits: distance, rules, refusal, consequences. When a king wants something wrong, the entire system can begin moving on his behalf. That is what happened here. There was an order. There were messengers. There was a destination. This was not just one bad choice. It came with staff. Power does not create character out of nowhere. It reveals what a person does when almost nobody can say no. David had been told who Bathsheba was. She was the wife of Uriah. The boundary had been clearly announced. There was no confusion, no missing detail, no technicality waiting to rescue him. He knew, and he sent for her anyway. It is like someone with rank, access, and influence turning a personal desire into an official action. The problem is not only what he wanted. The problem is what he could make happen. The palace responded because palaces respond to kings. The messengers did not need to agree. They only needed to obey. That is how private corruption becomes public machinery. One person crosses a line, and several others are pulled into helping him cross it. Probably not the kind of teamwork anyone planned to celebrate. David's choice was no longer hidden inside his mind. It now moved through hallways, through instructions, through people. Through doors opened because the request came from the king, and this is why the scene cannot be reduced to desire alone. Desire explains the impulse. Power explains the action. David had enough authority to remove obstacles and not enough restraint to stop himself. The man who once waited for the throne now acted as if waiting no longer applied to him. The man who had once respected limits now treated them like inconveniences. For a moment, it may have looked as though he had gotten exactly what he wanted. No public scandal, no immediate resistance, no visible collapse. That is how dangerous choices often begin. Quietly, efficiently, almost successfully. But consequences do not disappear just because powerful people cannot see them yet. And when the consequence appeared, David did not decide to tell the truth. Because apparently the first instinct after abusing power is often to use even more power afterward. He decided to control the story. The consequence appeared. Bathsheba sent word that she was pregnant. And just like that, David's private decision became a public problem waiting to happen. He could have stopped. He could have confessed. He could have accepted responsibility. Instead, he tried to edit reality. David sent for Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, who was still serving with the army. The plan was simple. Bring Uriah home. Ask a few questions about the battle. Send him to his house. Let time and appearances do the rest. Very strategic, just not in the way anyone expected from a king. Uriah returned, but he refused to go home while the other soldiers remained in the field. He slept near the palace entrance instead. That should have told David something. The soldier had more loyalty to the army than the king had to the truth, but David was no longer looking for truth. He was looking for a version of events that would protect him. So he tried again. He kept Uriah in Jerusalem. He gave him food, he gave him drink, he created another opportunity. And Uriah still did not go home. The cover story refused to cooperate. Apparently, when the truth refused to cooperate, David's solution was not to change himself. It was to keep changing everyone else's position until the lie somehow finally worked. This is where the story stops being only about desire. It becomes a cover-up. David had already crossed one line. Now he was willing to cross more lines to make the first one disappear. That is how concealed wrongdoing grows. The first decision creates a problem. The problem creates panic. Panic creates another decision. And soon the person is causing more damage to protect an image than the original act caused by itself. It is like someone making one serious mistake and then breaking everything around it, so nobody notices the first crack. David had once brought down a giant. Now he could not bring down his own lie. When Uriah would not fit the story David had prepared, David changed the story. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield carrying a sealed message. The message ordered the commander to place Uriah where the fighting was fiercest, then pull the other soldiers away. Uriah carried the instructions for his own death. David had turned desire into command. Now he turned reputation into a death sentence. And the palace machinery kept moving. Orders traveled. Commanders obeyed. Soldiers repositioned. Uriah died in battle. On paper, it could look like war. That was the point. But the famous scene was never the beginning. It was the moment the deeper problem became impossible to ignore. This was not merely a story about adultery. It was a story about sin trying to survive through reputation. David took one woman. Then he manipulated one soldier. Then he used an army to protect one lie. And what he was about to lose would not stay outside the palace. The price was about to enter his own house. The price did not arrive all at once. That would have been simpler. David took one woman, but what he really lost was control over what followed. That is the center of the story. He lost integrity. He lost peace. He lost moral authority. He lost stability inside his own family. And he lost the comforting illusion that power could hide what power had caused. At first, everything may have looked contained. Uriah was dead. Bathsheba was brought into the palace. The public story could be arranged. The king could continue sitting on the throne as if nothing had shifted. But consequences do not disappear because the paperwork looks clean. Some falls do not explode in one dramatic moment. They begin collecting payment in chapters. David's decision moved from the terrace into the palace, from the palace into the army, and from the army into his own house. The damage spread because every new choice had been designed to protect the previous one. That is what made the collapse larger. The original desire was serious. The abuse of power made it worse. The cover-up made it wider. The death of Uriah made it impossible to pretend this was only a private mistake. David had tried to control the narrative. Instead, the narrative had started controlling him. It is like hiding a crack in a wall while the entire house quietly begins to lean. A little paint might help for a day. It does not fix the foundation. David was still king, he still had a palace, he still had soldiers. So no, he did not lose everything in one afternoon. But he lost the things that made those victories worth having. He lost the ability to stand above the damage he had created. He lost the right to act as though his choices affected only him, and the consequences inside his family would continue long after the original moment had passed. That is what people often miss when they reduce the story to David and Bathsheba. The tragedy was not simply that David desired, it was that he took, it was that he used power, it was that he tried to control the consequences with more power. And power is very useful for giving orders. It is much less useful for making consequences disappear. Apparently, reality does not become cooperative just because a king is annoyed with it. David had defeated enemies in public. He had survived danger, betrayal, and war. But none of those victories protected him from what happened when he stopped governing himself. He could command messengers, he could move soldiers, he could shape appearances, he could not undo the choice. The throne remained, but the man on it was no longer untouched by what he had done. He won against giants where everyone could see him, but in secret, he lost to himself. Which story should be simplified next? Saul, Solomon, or Samson?